May be seated. Our kids can be dismissed. There's great things down the hall for them. To the rest of you, thank you so much for being here at Community Christian Church today. You probably know the story of Abraham Lincoln and Ford's Theater. You have to know, too, if you know that story, that John Wilkes Booth is the one that snuck up behind the president, Abraham Lincoln, as he was watching a play at Ford's Theater, shot Lincoln in the back of the head, and fled. You may even know that the president was then carried across the street to the back bedroom of a house, and it was there that the president died the next morning. Maybe even some of you have seen or been to that back bedroom. Anybody in the room? A few, yeah. And you've seen that blood-stained pillow that is there to this day. It's remotely possible that you know that throughout that fateful night, there were no less than 14 doctors attending Abraham Lincoln. Every one of them was convinced that the gunshot wound was fatal and that there was nothing that anyone could do. What I'm pretty confident that you don't know is that only one of those doctors gave his testimony at the trials that were conducted after the fact to bring the murderers to justice. Over 350 witnesses testified about what happened that night, but the Lincoln's family doctor, Dr. Robert Stone, was the only physician who was asked to share what he saw. He said this: "I was sent for by Mrs. Lincoln immediately after the assassination. I arrived there in a very few moments. I found that the president had been removed from the theater to the house of a gentleman living directly opposite the theater, had been carried into the back bedroom of the residence, and was there placed upon a bed. I found a number of gentlemen, citizens, around him. I proceeded then to examine him and instantly found that the president had received a gunshot wound in the back part of the left side of the head, into which I immediately carried my finger. At once I informed those around that the case was a hopeless one, that the president would die, that there was no positive limit to the duration of his life, that his vital tenacity was very strong, and that he would resist as long as any man could, but that death certainly would close the scene, and soon. I remained with him, doing whatever was in my power, assisted by my friends, to aid him. But of course, nothing could be done, and he died the next morning at about 7:30. For several Sundays, what we're doing here is we're looking at 40 days. We're looking at 40 days between Jesus walking out of the tomb alive and Jesus ascending up into heaven. And for those 40 days, what Jesus did was he spent his time showing up to people, convincing them that it was really him and that he was really alive. And he did that because if no one ever sees Jesus alive, then no one ever believes in him. The very salvation of the world depended on Jesus showing up to his friends and convincing them that he was alive. And so that's what he did. For 40 days, he appeared to them. He appeared to Mary. He appeared to 2 disciples on the road. He appeared to Peter. He appeared to his closest disciples. He appeared to 500 people at one time. Jesus spent 40 days making eyewitnesses to his risen again status. Eyewitnesses who heard, who saw, who touched a risen Jesus, and it's because of them that you and I know the name of Jesus today. One of those witnesses was the Apostle John. And John writes in one of his letters that Jesus was the word of life from the beginning. He says, "I was an eyewitness of Jesus. I saw him with my own eyes. I heard him speak. I looked upon his glory. I even touched what I am writing you about. I touched a resurrected Jesus." Dr. Stone's testimony by the side of Abraham Lincoln is kind of graphic. Like sticking your finger into a gunshot wound isn't really bedtime story material, right? But we have the same thing. When John says, "We touched him," when he writes that, he's pointing back to another story of another finger and another fatal wound. In the account that John writes in his gospel in chapter 20 that we just read, John says just before what we just read that on the evening of Jesus' resurrection, the disciples are all together, and they are inside because they are afraid of their lives. You can understand why they might be afraid. They're thinking they came after Jesus, they might come after us. What if they come after us too? And so they got out of sight somewhere into a house, and John writes that they take this extra precaution of locking the doors. And they huddle together with the shades drawn and the doors bolted shut, and suddenly Jesus comes and stood among them. It means that he walked through locked doors. Maybe he walked through a wall. Now, it's important for you to understand here, he's not a ghost. He has as solid a body as you and me because he invites them to touch him. John says later, we did that. Even after this, Jesus will eat fish with these same disciples. So he has a body just like yours and just like mine, but it's a body not like yours and mine at all because it wasn't limited by the laws of nature as we know them. And so Jesus shows up to his disciples. Now, if you're counting along, this is now appearance number 5 that Jesus makes on the very first day that he walks out of the tomb. It started with Mary in John chapter 20, then the other women in Matthew chapter 28, the two on the road that we talked about last week in Luke chapter 24, Peter himself in Luke 24, and now all of his disciples as they were together, he appears to them. Well, almost all of them. John points out that one of them was not there. Verse 24 says, Thomas was not with them when Jesus came. Thomas, one of the 12. And a really good question at this point is, why is John telling us about Thomas? Thomas is never a major disciple, is never a major character, but here we get this story of Thomas. Why put this story here? John will write in this very same chapter, just after he tells us the story of Thomas, he will write this. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. What that means is that John had far more material about the life of Jesus than he could ever use. Do you know that as John writes his book, he only gives us about 21 days, maybe 22 days, in the entire life of Jesus? That's it. And a third of those days cover the last week of his life. That's all we get. And so this account that John writes is not a biography of Jesus. It's a carefully selected story so that we can believe and have life in Jesus' name. John puts this together very strategically. And so he not only chose to be selective with only a few stories, but then he puts this story about Thomas as the climax of the whole book. Of all he heard Jesus say, all John saw Jesus do, all John watched Jesus at work with, there are so many more books that one could write. He decided this story was more important than all the others, and the entire gospel account builds to this. And so let's ask about Thomas today a few questions. First, why wasn't he there? Number 2, why did he doubt? And then 3, why did he believe? Start with why wasn't he there? And the answer is really short. We don't know. Right? You love that? I studied hard for that one. We don't know. All the disciples are together. They're sharing about having seen Jesus, and they're discussing what it might mean. They're in this house with locked doors, and Thomas is not behind the locked door like everyone else. Why? I don't know. Maybe he needed groceries. Maybe he went for a run to clear his head. Maybe he was the person in the group that processed grief best by being alone. And so he was alone. That was his chief concern. We don't know. Here's what we do know. Because he was absent, he missed seeing Jesus. Because he was absent, he missed seeing Jesus. I did a funeral a long time ago with Leon Weiss. Some of you know Leon, remember Leon from his time here. And the funeral we did was for a man who was very active in church when Leon was here, but he hadn't been a part of things since then. He had kind of checked out of church, this man had. And I remember discussing that with Leon on the way actually to the cemetery. And Leon asked me, what do you think of that? He said, here's somebody who believed in Jesus, had been baptized, was faithful for a season, but for whatever reason, he was not in the room with the other believers here in this place for a lot of years. What about somebody like that? That was Leon's question to me. Are they still a part of God's family? And we talked through the fact that only God knows what's really going on in the heart, and who are we to be in the judgment seat of God when it comes to salvation? And Scripture talks about people walking away from the faith, but it's such a stubborn, long, hard road for somebody to take. But here's what we both agreed on very firmly. If this man still is in the grace of God, then wow, did he miss out on what God was doing all those years? Why was he not here? I don't know. But he missed out on Jesus. Jesus wanted to continue and mold him and shape him in certain ways, and he missed out. Jesus wanted to encourage him and build him up through the voice and the hearts of other believers around him, and he missed out. Jesus wanted him to be significant in the lives of others, to love and be loved in return, and he missed out on that. Jesus wanted love and peace and joy for that man to the fullest extent possible. I'm not suggesting he didn't have those things, but he could have had them more, and he wasn't in the room. He missed out. Who knows what he could have been that now he will never be? And that's Thomas. Thomas was gone. He missed out on experiencing a resurrected Christ. He missed out when Jesus came to his disciples. He gave them peace. He gave them proof. He gave them power. He gave them purpose. And all of that Jesus came to give them, and Thomas missed it. And it meant that he had to live the next week in fear and unbelief when he could have been living that week in joy and hope. Living even a week in doubt and fear is too much. And so let's take the lesson today. If you think about stepping away from the people that God has strategically put in your life, would you just take a moment and just remember Thomas? If you risk Jesus, you risk Jesus showing up if you're not here and you miss it. Here's the second question. Why did he doubt? When Thomas did come back, John writes that he got gang-tackled by all the others about what he missed. Have you ever been there? Mary told him, "I've seen Jesus." The other women said, "Us too." Cleopas and his wife said, "You'll never believe this one. We had supper with him." Well, almost. Peter said, "Thomas, it's true. I saw him myself. And then he appeared to us all in this very room, even though the door was locked." Jesus is alive, and all of these others are telling him, and the line in the text is a present progressive. It means they didn't tell him just once. They told him, and they kept on telling him over and over and over. They told him, "Have you been there? Something really special happens that you weren't there for, and people never let you forget that you weren't there." That's Thomas. And despite all that testimony, Thomas would not believe. The word means to trust or to accept. And he not only said, "I will not trust what you say, I won't accept what you're saying," but the grammar he uses is a double negative. He says, "I will not ever believe what you're saying." And I want you to understand here at this point that Thomas has exactly what you and I have. We have the eyewitness testimony of people who saw the risen Christ. You and I didn't see him risen, right? We weren't there in the room when it happened. We're just like Thomas. We were gone. And yet, we have enough evidence by the way of the testimony of the people who did see Jesus to believe that he lives. Even when Jesus does show up to Thomas, what he does is he rebukes him for not listening to the others who tried to tell him what had happened. Jesus says to Thomas, "Stop disbelieving and believe." And so John puts this story here for us on purpose. And one of those reasons is to say to us, would you please listen to the people who saw Jesus alive? Their testimony is enough for you to believe. Stop disbelieving and believe. You have enough to do that. Why didn't Thomas listen? Maybe it was his personality. I need hard evidence, right? Maybe he was skeptical. Dead people don't come back from the dead. Or maybe this. Maybe Thomas had had enough. Maybe you know of somebody who lost somebody close to them, and they did everything they could. They had hope for the longest time. They just knew that there was a cure, that there was a remedy, that there was a diet, that there was a doctor, there was something out there, and it kept giving them hope, and they tried it all, and for a while it looked promising, but then reality set in one day. Nothing is working, and just like Abraham Lincoln on that night, everybody knows at some point that this will only end one way. Maybe you've kind of been in that position. If so, if somebody comes up to you with yet another solution, if you just fly to this country, they have the answer. You might not say, I've been praying for this, let's go. Instead, it might be in line for you to say, no more. I can't take this anymore. I'm exhausted. This has taken everything I have. I've been through the ringer. I cannot do this again. I cannot get my hopes up again like that just to have them dashed. I'm not that strong. There comes a time when you just want it to be over. And maybe that's Thomas. Thomas kind of gets a bad rap in this story. This story is why he is called Doubting Thomas. That's curious, because we never call Peter Denying Peter, right? That's not a nickname. We don't call Mark Buck Naked Mark. That's actually a story. Maybe you need to read that. Thomas, though, we call Doubting Thomas. But really, there's no indication in Scripture that he was any less passionate and faithful than any of the other disciples. He loved Jesus just as much as any of them, and he was just as devastated by the cross as any of those other disciples. He got his hopes up about Jesus, about what Jesus was doing, and then Rome ended it with a cross, and now people are coming to him trying to get his hopes up again. And maybe there's something in Thomas that just can't go along with that. Don't you dare get my hopes up like that. Jesus is dead. I saw him taken off the cross and buried. It would physically take me putting my finger in his gaping wounds for you to get my hopes up like that again. I won't do it. Thomas is given another name in the text. The Greek is Didymus. Didymus. It just means twin. And so he has a twin. We don't know who the twin was. We never are given that information. And I hesitate to be presumptuous like this, but I do know who Thomas's twin is. It is you and it is me. There are times, just like Thomas, we choose not to believe. We choose not to listen to the people who tell us about Jesus. We choose not to believe, not because we really think that the whole Jesus thing is hogwash, but because maybe we don't want to be disappointed by yet another thing in this life. I don't want to be pulled into something and get my hopes up that this is the answer to life, only to be rug pulled. I can't take that. And a lot of us can see ourselves in Thomas, and he's our twin in that way. And if he is, if you can readily see yourself in the doubts of Thomas, then I would encourage you, you need to also see yourself in his belief. Here's what happens. 8 days later, this time, Thomas is in the room with everybody else. So give him credit for that. He kept showing up. He kept being close to those who believed, even when he didn't. And so 8 days later, he's with the disciples in the same kind of setting as before, maybe even the same place. John says the doors were locked just like before, and Jesus shows up again. And as a result of this encounter, Thomas, who is the biggest doubter, becomes the biggest believer. Something triggers in him to the most beautiful, lofty confession of faith that is found anywhere in the Bible. This profession of faith that Thomas makes is why John chooses to end his book with this story. He drives the whole gospel account to this story, and it's all about what Thomas says. Thomas doesn't see Jesus and say, "Wow, you really are alive. Look at you glowing, Jesus. Really cool. Awesome." No. Look at it. What does he say? He says, "My Lord and my God." There's so much in that line. Here's a Jewish man proclaiming that another Jewish man is Lord and God. That is unbelievable. That is the last thing that any God-fearing Jewish man would do. It is actually blasphemy to say something like this. But also, pay attention to the my Lord and my God. This was personal. One of the things you should see in this text is that no one has to tell Jesus what Thomas's conditions were for him to believe. He had conditions that if he were to believe had to be met. And some of us are twins with Thomas in that too. I'll believe if. Have you ever said that? Thomas's if was this: if I touch his hands and his side, then I'll believe. Do you have an if today? Here's the thing. No one has to tell Jesus about Thomas's if. Jesus already knows it. When Jesus shows up, 8 days later, it's squarely for Thomas. He appears to all of them. He gives them the same peace that he gave them before. It's peace be with you. And then he turns to Thomas specifically, and he says, "Thomas, put your finger here in my hand. Thomas, reach out your hand. Place it in my side." Why? Because Jesus knew the conditions that Thomas had laid down. Nobody had to tell him. He showed up and he gave Thomas exactly what Thomas asked for 8 days earlier. And Thomas is amazed. "How did you know, Lord?" But you did. You care about me. You hear me and listen to me even when I don't think you're there, even when I doubt you, even when I didn't believe, you are right there beside me. And that melted Thomas' heart. It's my Lord and my God. It doesn't matter who you are today. Maybe you're the biggest denier on the planet. Maybe you're the one who isolates himself from everybody else. Maybe you're the one who is at zero when it comes to Jesus. It does not matter. Here's a man who went from all of those things. He was the biggest doubter, the biggest denier, but he becomes the greatest believer. My Lord and my God. And if Thomas can make that turn, then you can too. There is hope. You can be his twin in belief. You have everything you need to do so. Here's question number 3. How did he come to believe? How did he come to be this biggest believer that John would put this story as the climax of his gospel? Probably the most impactful thing that John wants us to see in this episode are the wounds of Jesus. It's here twice. Jesus shows up to the disciples without Thomas, and he says, "See my hands and my side." And this is what they tell Thomas. And so that's why he makes that the condition. That's what I need to see. And so 8 days later, Jesus shows up again to everyone, but really to Thomas, and he says the same thing. "See my hands, see my side." And to Thomas, he even gives the invitation to touch his wounds. You laid the condition down, Thomas. Here it is. Stop disbelieving and believe. It's exactly what Thomas asked for, to touch. I'll believe when I can touch. I want you to look closely at the text. Does Thomas ever touch Jesus' hands or side? The history of Christian art says that he does. Painting after painting, this is a Caravaggio, show Thomas putting his finger in the wound like the good doctor must have done with Lincoln. Renaissance artists, I guess, like the creepy factor, because that kind of creeps me out, that picture. But in the text, there's no indication that that ever happens. Here's what we read. Thomas immediately confesses, "My Lord and my God." Jesus even says, "Thomas, you believed because you've seen me." He doesn't say you've believed because you've touched me. Thomas thought he needed a touch to believe that Jesus was alive. If I see his wounds, if I touch them, I'll know he's alive. But the moment he saw them, he realized that he did not need to touch them at all in order to believe. He believed immediately. He saw in the wounds of Jesus evidence of much more than just Jesus being alive. He saw the proof of something else. I want you to think about what your hope is for your body when you get to heaven. What is it? Obviously, this exercise will come a little easier to those of us who have seen a few years and maybe a few hundred dozen cookies, right? But maybe you want to be a little more chiseled in heaven. Maybe you've always wanted a better nose. Maybe you want different color eyes. Maybe hair. You just want hair in the right place and not in the wrong place anymore. I want to see clearly. Maybe we want to be different in either height or width or depth. Here's the point. If you have a bum knee in this life, the thing you do not expect is a bum knee in heaven. You expect a perfect one. If you have a scar somewhere from an accident maybe and it messed up your look in some way, you don't expect that to be a part of your body in heaven. You expect a perfectly new and remade body, all without flaws. And if that's true, if that's what we expect, and it is what we expect. Why? Because we're told in Scripture that that's what we are to expect. If that's true, if that's what we expect, then why does Jesus have flaws on his resurrected body? He still has scars. When Thomas saw them, his mind surely flashed to how they got there in the first place. The disciples saw the cross happen. Thomas saw Jesus on the cross. He saw the nails go into his hands. He saw the spear go into his side. And what they saw in those moments was the destruction of all their hopes of what Jesus had come to do. They saw those wounds on the cross, and they thought, this is the end of Jesus, and this is also probably the end of us. But now, Jesus shows Thomas his wounds. Thomas looks at Jesus, a very alive Jesus, and looks at those same wounds that he saw happen on the cross, and he realizes that the very thing he thought was the end of Jesus and the end of him was in fact just proof of the beginning. There are two friends that were hunting in a wide open, barren part of land, and far away on the horizon, they noticed a cloud of smoke, and sooner than they had hoped, they realized that there was a fire heading their way, and quickly they heard the crackling, and a wind came up, and they realized that there was no way that they could outrun the fire that was advancing towards them. And so one of them stopped. He got down on the ground. He began to rifle through his pockets, and he emptied the contents of his backpack, and he finally found what he was looking for, which is a box of matches. He struck the match to his friend's amazement, and he lit a small fire where they were standing. And soon that fire had grown enough that they were able to move into a huge circle of blackened earth. and they covered their mouths. They hunkered down so that when the real fire came near, it swept over them, and it ended up that they were completely unhurt. They weren't even touched. Why? Because fire can't burn what is already burned. And the death of Christ, seen in his wounds, is that burned over place for us. That's what Thomas saw. He saw in the wounds of Jesus that his sin had been paid for. He saw that he had been healed by the wounds of Jesus. He saw that the wounds of Jesus did not end him, but saved him. Here's the crazy thing. Dr. Robert Stone looked at the wounds of Abraham Lincoln and immediately concluded this is the end. This only ends one way. Here's Thomas, looking at wounds that are very similar. They're as fatal as Abraham Lincoln's, but they're on Jesus. And he concludes the entire opposite thing. This is just the start. This leads to life. Thomas wanted to see wounds as proof that Jesus was alive. What he saw in the scars was proof that Jesus loved him enough to die for him and win eternity. Here's what the eyewitness Thomas teaches us. Teaches us that we have a wounded God. We have a God that has been run through. We have a God with a fatal wound, a God who went to a cross for us so that we might live. And those wounds blasted through Thomas's doubts and his fears and his unbelief. As we've gone through these accounts, I hope you notice how much Jesus is constantly showing people his wounds. He shows Thomas his wounds. He shows his disciples his wounds. Why does he do this? Because faith is saying, "My Lord and my God, I see your wounds are enough for me. I see that because of your wounds, I can be accepted. Because of your wounds, I can be forgiven. I can be free. Because of your wounds, life will not end, but life can begin. Your wounds are enough. They're enough." And that's the invitation today. Would you look at his wounds, and would you come to the conclusion, your wounds are enough? The salvation that you need today is only found in his hands and in his side, and it is just up to you to receive it. The other gods were strong, but thou wast weak. They rode, but thou didst stumble to a throne. But to our wounds, only God's wounds can speak, and not a God has wounds, but thou alone. Would you stand? Let's worship this God who has wounds.